There are a few more impactful things for the success of your cybersecurity company these days than how you position what you do. If buyers are unclear about what you do, unclear what you do for them, and unclear how you are different to the 5 other companies they've already talked to, they will not buy from you. Medium and large companies turn to Bob Wright, the partner at Firebrick Consulting, to help them with this. Today, we get to hear from Bob and learn how he thinks about positioning and how you as a smaller company can think differently about how you go to market and how you position the company. This is a really good discussion. Don't go away. Welcome to the Cybersecurity Startup Revenue Podcast, where we help cybersecurity companies grow revenue faster. I am your host, Andrew Monahan. Our guest today is Bob Wright, partner at Firebrick Consulting. Bob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting conversation. I think it's a conversation that is sorely needed right now in the cybersecurity industry. And when we get into the discussion, I think it'll become obvious to everyone why that's the case. Well, let's talk about the conversation that you and I are going to have just now, Bob. Let me tee it up like this. So I moved from the UK to the US in January of 2000. Very different time. Things were different in all sorts of different ways. In the cybersecurity area, things were in probably 2 or 3 generations before they are right now. I got given a Silicon Valley territory as a salesperson at McAfee. And I set out of as you do as a salesperson, I got to go meet some people, right? And within 3 months, I met with 17 of the 25 target companies that I went out to get involved with, right? So what I found was it was relatively easy to do that. Why is that? Very few companies in cybersecurity in those days. In fact, it was called information security. It wasn't even called cyber, right? I don't know how many vendors there were, but I'm going to guess low hundreds, if that, just not too many. And that's because it was quite hard to start a company in those days. It wasn't so easy. There's hardware usually involved to set up your website. A lot of the products actually in cybersecurity were hardware-based products, which requires a whole bunch of different type of engineering. The VC world to get money was a kind of murky world. It was much less transparent than it is these days. And as a result, there was far fewer companies competing for the attention of the people that I was trying to get in touch with. And then the second thing that was happening at that time was it was pre-LinkedIn, it was pre-Zoom Info. So knowing who to go after and their phone number and their email and things like that just wasn't all that common. And when you did know, you had to do all manually, right? You had to send emails manually. You had to, call manually. It was all hard work. But, if you were prepared to do the work, you got the meetings, which is my experience. Fast forward to May 2023, as we're recording this session today, there's 3,400 vendors now in cybersecurity. Much easier to get your company going, much easier, it has been anyway, until the last year to raise money. And I wouldn't say it's ever easy to create a product, but it's certainly a little bit easier than it was maybe 20 plus years ago. And of course, on the sales side, in 5 seconds, you can find out who the CISO is at any of these companies you're trying to target. You'll know their email and phone number in another 5 seconds. And it'll probably take you a minute to drop them in a sequence of 10 other emails and LinkedIn outreaches and phone calls that have already been set up for you to bombard them with messages. And that therein lies the challenge that we're experiencing, where CISOs are saying, hold on, way too much undifferentiated messaging. People all sound the same to me. I can't tell the differences. They all use the same buzzwords, but a different order to try and describe what they do. And they make claims that they can't really back up. And it's a world in which is all very confusing. And in a world of confusion, then everybody loses at that point, which is why, coming on to our discussion, positioning and how you describe yourself is such an important thing these days, I think, in many markets, but especially in the market this audience is in cybersecurity. When you hear me describe that, Bob, does that kind of ring true, or have you got more to add about the confusing world that everyone's in these days?
Like I said, the success of the past is now irrelevant. So the things you did in the past will not work today. It's very true. I think what the good news is in cybersecurity, there's been a groundswell, I would say a tsunami of investment that's being called for So there's big budgets right now. The bad news is, like you said, you have 3,000, 4,000 companies all chasing that budget. And can you imagine being a CISO today, being bombarded, right, by vendors? It's got to be and you're probably going to get fired from your job anyway in 2 years. So it's a very difficult role. I think that's where the role of positioning really helps. And we've worked with probably a dozen cybersecurity companies because now positioning does move to the forefront. The question is, how do you separate yourselves from the pack if your buyers really don't want to talk to you or engage with you, or they don't want any more tech, right? How do you, as a cybersecurity company, actually separate from the pack, engage an executive buyer, and actually, close a deal? And that's where positioning really comes in. The companies that are separating from the pack are the companies that have really strong narratives and positioning. And specifically, I would say own a very distinct corner of the room in the cybersecurity category. The way you described it, say the room you walk in right now is the cybersecurity category. If you and all your competitors are lumped in the middle, that's a really bad place to be unless you're, a Palo or a CrowdStrike or one of these companies. Because in the absence of any differentiation, what is a buyer going to do? Number one, they won't make a decision because they can't figure it out. Or number two, they said, hey, everybody sounds the same, so I'm just going to go with the brand name company. So if you're a Palo or a CrowdStrike or one of these significant players, your positioning strategy is make the market commoditized. Anytime a new entrant comes into the market, they'll raise their hand and say, we're going to come out with that in the next 12 to 18 months. But for everybody else, that's a really bad place to be, is in the middle of the room, in the category, if you will, and you look the same as everybody else. So everybody else, all the other players have to have a very strong positioning that clearly differentiates them from the brand name players and all the other cacophony of noise, if you will, that's in the market today.
And we've used the word positioning to talk about this so far, and your business is positioning. Now, I would kind of hazard a guess that for many people, this is a word they throw around without perhaps really understanding quite what it means and quite maybe the power behind proper positioning as well. How would you help someone understand really what the meaning is behind it all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a lot of, I think, confusion in the B2B market, tech market, particularly about what's, branding versus positioning versus messaging. I draw a very clear distinction between the three. For me, branding, and they're all three important. Branding for me is what's the tone, what's the experience of the company, what's the visual expression, if you will, the corporate identity. And that's very different from positioning. Positioning is how do I shape a category and own a very distinct category, corner of the category, and drive a really clear differentiation. And then messaging is a description of what you do. So I'm clearly in the positioning lane, so to speak, about how do we help companies separate from the pack, differentiate, own a very clear, distinct corner of the room. And today, I think a lot of positioning is being used to create urgency in sales cycles, because for a lot of our clients, status quo is the competition, because with a finite number of buying dollars out there that's being chased, the question is, how do you turn medium intent buyers into create urgency of them? And likewise, for the money that is available and being spent, how do you grab your share of the wallet and clearly differentiate you from the other and compete better and improve your win-loss ratio in those particular sales cycles? So really, positioning is really how do you own a particular perception in the minds of your buyers? I call it how do you own a distinct corner of the room, and how do you create urgency in sales cycles?
I think right now, urgency is what many companies are after. We've seen deal cycles extend out, and as you said, status quo has become the norm. You got to really have some sort of compelling reason to go off the status quo. Um, One of the things I hear, Bob, from companies is we are differentiated, right? We have things that are different. We've got this thing that goes faster. We got this thing which is better suited for AWS. We got various things that we do differently, and yet somehow that doesn't seem to come across. Why might that be?
Well, I think one of the cardinal rules in our industry is the superior product doesn't always win. the superior product doesn't always win. And I came out of product marketing, right? You spend all this time with the engineering team, your customers, define the product, build the MRDs and everything, come running out when the product's ready to go. And what's the first thing you want to talk about? All the great features and functions that your product has that may be different from your competition. Your buyers don't care about how your product works. Your buyers don't care about how your product works. They really want to know why you matter. They want to know why you matter. So what really is being required is how do you turn your geek speak and your great superior IP and technology whiz bang stuff into solving a distinct problem for your buyer. All buyers buy from pain and problems. So the winning positioning is not the one that spouts all the features and functions and talks about themselves. The winning the winning tech companies or cybersecurity companies are the ones that actually put their product in the context of a problem that they own and a problem that their buyer deeply cares about. And they're actually selling the problem, not the product, if that makes sense to you. And so any company right now and this is regardless of a crowded market like cybersecurity or any of our tech markets that is riddled with, feature-rich narratives out there, the number one key to positioning is what is the big, hairy, multi-million-dollar urgent buyer problem that you own and how can you build a case that your unique features can uniquely solve that problem? And that's the key fundamental power of positioning.
Is there an example that you can take us through from you've worked with a cybersecurity company before?
Yeah, we just did a whole bunch of work with Cisco, right? Cisco, huge company. They have a whole business unit specifically for cybersecurity, probably made 12, 17 investments in the last year into every single market category that you can imagine. But the question is, what does Cisco stand for? They've got one of everything. So what's the portfolio stand for? What does the Cisco security business unit stand for? So we built a really interesting conversation around security resilience and owning that corner of the room. If you look, as we've gone through the pandemic and we're coming out post-pandemic, there's all kinds of conversations about financial resiliency, supply chain resilience, employee resiliency, and can you build a case that what's also required to make any of those works is security resiliency. And can you own that conversation in the corner of the room? And that's part of what we did with Cisco and their whole portfolio. That's the rallying cry of their whole portfolio is owning that corner of the room called security resilience, which is a very different corner of the room. And it's identified with a very distinct problem in the market. The question is, a lot of times with these companies, can you make the CISO a hero? When I do positioning, I always imagine, here's a CISO, right? It's a really difficult job. That's a very difficult job today. And, everybody's calling you up because they got problems. Nobody's calling up saying, this is great, So I think in that case, is there a way that you as a cybersecurity vendor make them a hero? So part of what we did for Cisco is security resilience is we had, what are the 7 principles of security resilience? Now the CISOs are going with a security resilience plan to their boards, again, looking like a hero that's very connected to some very real problems. So I always feel like good positioning also, it not only explains why you matter, in other words, own a problem and show how you can uniquely solve that problem, but how can you fundamentally change the lives of your buyers and make them the hero? And I think that's a really important thing, particularly for the CISO, because that particular executive is under fire, a lot of these companies. And the question I always ask is, how can your technology and platform, cybersecurity goodness, make your CISO a hero?
And when I think about a CISO, Bob, you're right. They're in a tough job. No one ever calls them and say, "Good news, congratulations, we didn't get breached today," right? They only get the call when things are going
Totally.
bad. And as they're thinking though about vendors that come on their radar, they're probably thinking or asking themselves some questions, right? They, of course, maybe subconsciously they want to be a hero, but they probably got more practical things they're asking themselves about your company that you need to be aware of. Have I got that sort of close to being correct?
Yeah, I think the problem is if you're a startup cybersecurity company, right? It's interesting. Whenever we take our executives through our process, the first thing we ask is, who is this positioning for? Who's the market? Oh, we're for the Fortune 500. And I'm looking at them going, well, probably 498 of those companies wouldn't buy it because you're too small and the other two aren't ready, right? So I think it's really, really important to get clear about who your target market is for positioning, who your positioning really is for, and where is your next set of revenue going to come from? What do those buyers look like? And I think, again, it comes down to what's the big, hairy problem, multi-million-dollar problem you can solve. So, for example, let's take, um, vulnerability management, right? That was a new category of software that happened a number of years ago, right? Well, what was the problem it solved? It solved that the problem is that it solved is you got IT departments are overwhelmed by patches. Security and IT are fighting over this stuff, right? Because the stuff's not patched and kept up to date, and it's creating these exposure levels, right? And you got all these vulnerabilities, if you will, that are showing up in the infrastructure. So again, that's the problem, if you will. And if you can go to a CISO and say, look, you have IT, you have friction between your IT and security departments. Oh yeah, we do. Right? Are there all, is it a hard time keeping up with all the patches and these continuous releases that are being offered across our multi-environment IT? Oh yeah, we are. And that's the big problem we solve. A lot of times you can even name the problem, if you will. So I think, again, it's really, really important. What's the big, hairy problem that you solve, and get out of the buzzword bingo, if you will, about, your type of SASE or your type of zero trust or whatever, right? Because I think a glazed look is just set over, our buyers now, right? Because of all these buzzwords. So I think it's important, to be in these categories, but also say, here's the specific problem that we saw.
I think I'm wondering if there's a fine line between creating the naming the category, naming the problems, security, resiliency, versus what a CISO or a security team might view as just another bunch of buzzwords, right? Where's that fine line between something that actually has meaning for them that they get, and the other side, which is, well, that just sounds a little bit stupid.
Yeah, I think it's not creating buzzwords really. I think what's really important is what I think is really important is what is the problem you solve, right? So when we work with our clients, one of the first things we do is let me talk to 10 customers of yours, 10 that you've just sold, right? In the past year, not somebody you sold 5 years ago or 7 years ago, but I want to talk to the 10 customers that look like your next set of buyers. And every single one of those buyers is, what was the trigger event that caused you to raise your hand and initiate a project? And I listen for the language they use and look for the patterns. And after a while, you'll see the same patterns, and so it's important to put the problem in the language your buyers have. But I always look at the patterns. What causes a buyer to raise their hand and create a trigger event and actually put budget to something? What do they think the problem is that they're solving? And that helps lead to that answer of what's the big, hairy problem you solve, and can you name that problem?
Bob, let's get to know you a bit more. I'm going to ask you to pick 3 numbers between 1 and 35, and I'll read out the corresponding question.
All right, number 7.
7 is, what is your favorite summer pastime?
Oh, my favorite summer pastime is bodyboarding.
Bodyboarding? Where do you do that?
Out at Stinson Beach.
Is it not a bit cold?
You got to wear a wetsuit, brother.
Oh my goodness.
It's not for the faint of
For
heart.
sure. Oh no. Must be fun though, right?
Yeah, it is.
All right. One more number, team 1 and 35.
How about number 31?
31. What is your favorite city to visit?
Wow, that is a really difficult question right now. Can I have a couple of them?
Go on then. Give me 2.
I'm going to give you Cusco. Probably, Cusco, I would say, and somewhere in Bhutan. They don't have really big cities.
All right. So I can't let you go by with Cusco and somewhere in Bhutan. So Cusco in Peru, the start of the trail right up to Machu Picchu. Is that right?
Yeah. The Inca Trail.
What is it about Cusco that you love?
It has layers of history to it, and the indigenous culture is still very, very present. And there's just people from all over, travelers from all over the world that have either moved there or are visiting there. And it's just a fascinating place. And it's just not the Inca Trail. there's all kinds of things going on there in Peru and specifically in Cusco. It's very, very spiritual city and with a lot of nuance and a lot of layers to it.
Now, as cosmopolitan as Cusco might be, I'm imagining any city in Bhutan not being the same as that, but maybe I've got that wrong. What is it
No,
about
there
Bhutan that you love?
there is no big city in Bhutan, gratefully. What I love about Bhutan is it feels like you're stepping back into another world. And, everybody is still wearing the traditional clothing. The good news is English is the second language, so it's pretty easy to get around. It's a Buddhist country, and it was probably like Tibet was before, a long, long, long time ago. So you go into the temples, there's nobody really there. It has all these mountains, right? It's right up against the Himalayas, so it has mountains and these big rivers flowing through the valleys and monasteries everywhere, and it's just a really lovely, and the people are really, really lovely.
And you are the first person I've ever met that's been to Bhutan. How
Well,
about
there you
that?
go. You can't. Not very many people can go there because you have to have a permit to get in. So
Okay.
they try to keep people out. So
What an interesting place, though. Fascinating that you've been there. All right, last number, team 1 in 35.
why don't we go with 34?
34. Wow, this is going to be interesting. Which cybersecurity startup do you admire most right now, if any?
I would say there's a company called Exabeam. I don't know if they're a startup still, but they're pretty close to it. Um, Exabeam, I would say, is an interesting company right now. And because
Yeah, they're in an interesting submarket, right, in the sim space.
yeah, they're trying
Very
to
nascent.
create the security ops space at the same time, disrupt and be the next gen sim, if you will, which is really, really interesting. So, and I think the other big thing about it is really where they're focused on is compromised credentials. And I think that's one of the number one cyber security issue today is compromised credentials that are impacting companies of all sizes. So they've really taken that on with their SIM and some of the other software that they have built on top of it to really help companies get a handle on their, um, you know, on that compromised credentials issue.
And you've got a pretty forward-thinking and visionary CEO in Mike DeCesar there,
That's
right?
right. That's right.
I was thinking about my clients and people I work with. They're early stage companies, right? So they're seed A, maybe some of them are B as well. So they're in that mode of coming to market. They're trying to scratch out their part of the market, their corner of the room, as you're talking about. If I think about a small player coming into a market with a dominant big player, right? Call it Palo. Right now in cloud, call it Wiz, right? These companies are just they're big companies that you're trying to get your fair share from. How does a small company think about competing like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's $1 million question. And I think, again, you have to solve it. The question is, why do we need a new company in this category, right? Why do you need a new company? And take SASE. Why do you need a new SASE company, right? Why? And the question, that's the answer. That's the question you have to answer. So, and what I mean by that is what's great right now is we just came through a pandemic and we're in the midst of a huge transformation of business, right? There's a business inflection point. Is it possible to build a case that the old software, Palo and all these guys were built for another era? They were born for a completely different cybersecurity era. And can you describe the differences between today's era and yesterday's era to build a case why it warrants a next generation of solution? And that's the argument that's being asked to be made if you're coming in to compete against an existing category. The other thing that I think is really interesting is to create a distinction between what you do in the old guard, if you will, is say, we got an XYZ type, we got a data first SASE, or we have an experience first SASE, or whatever, but name your type of SASE to draw a very clear distinction from yesterday's SASE and say, look, yesterday's SASE was born for another year. We're in the post-pandemic era. We've just gone through an inflection point. It's a new era of business. It's a new era of threats and exposure, if you will, that requires a different kind of XYZ cybersecurity or I was using the example of SASE.
It's funny how you picked that one. I don't know if you did it on purpose, but of course, the ding against the VPNs in the past is they weren't experienced first. It was the most horrible user experience you could get,
Totally.
right?
There you go.
So you're by default just lining up against that emotional, yeah, this sucks. Kind of the old way sucks. I just know it, right?
Yeah. That's right. And that's the one way to do it. The other one is if you're a startup, a lot of times you are creating a new category. So again, it's the same thing. Why do you need a new category? Oh, because there's a new cybersecurity problem that the old class, the traditional cybersecurity companies weren't born to solve because this new problem wasn't around when they came into existence.
So if we're that early stage company, then how do we get going on these discussions, right? Is there some framework or a principle or something that they should be thinking about to say, yeah, let's just start, working through this a bit ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's important to have it. Again, we have a positioning process we take our executive teams through, and what pops out is a narrative. So it's really important. It's your sales deck, if you will. and but the sales deck should not start with your products and features in your companies because nobody cares about. Your sales deck really needs to start with the problem you solve. The advent of the convergence of recent market dynamics has caused a brand new problem called the XYZ problem. Slide 3. And it's going to get worse because it's not going away and you will lose your job. Slide 4. Traditional approaches to cybersecurity will no longer solve this new problem. The slide after that. What are the 4 or 5 buying criteria that's necessary to solve that problem? Then introduce your company and then connect that problem and the buying criteria to your differentiation. That's the winning positioning narrative and story. Again, it's not about you, it's about them. And can you wake up the market with a different conversation and say, we've got a viewpoint based upon these market dynamics. There's a new XYZ problem. Traditional approaches it's not you're wrong. It's just they were born for a different era, not designed to solve that problem. Here's the 3 or 4 things you have to do to solve the problem. New capabilities, you have to arm your cybersecurity teams to solve that problem. Then introduce your company, then connect it to, and that requires a different kind of cybersecurity platform with these capabilities.
So right there, that last description about the ideal deck, that's for sellers, right? That's the money bit right there, right? You're right. We get tied up in ourselves too much, and here's the amazing things that we're thinking about. Here's our vision. Here's our mission. Here's our we I stuff, and then oh yeah, we got something that solves a problem for you. And what you've articulated right there is almost the exact opposite, right?
That's correct.
You start with the prospect, start with the buyer in mind. What do they care about? What are they experiencing? How can this be valuable for them? And then way down the road, then you think about, well, how do we do that? And how do we solve those problems?
That's
You
correct.
said something before, Bob, that I want to go back to, and that was almost selling the problem. What does that mean?
Well, for example, let me give you an example. We had a client here of ours that created a new category around, we called it digital intent. Well, who needs digital intent? What the hell is that? That's another buzzword, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the problem they solve is as everybody's gone digital now, on all these digital sites now, we have so much fraud. And the problem is you're starting to lock down those sites, but you're turning away all these good customers, right? So first off, fraud is still getting through. And second, you're turning away good customers, right? That's a hairy problem for a lot of companies, particularly if most of their commerce is done digitally. So you build a case that what's being really required is all the software that was built in the past, right, was not designed to solve this particular problem. The trade-off between fraud and locking everything down and let your good customers in. That requires a new capability called digital intent, right? And digital intent, and then you go to describe it, right? And that's the winning thing is moved from a product-centric positioning to a buyer-centric positioning and really answering 3 questions. What's the big hairy problem you solve? How can you uniquely solve it? What are your differentiators? And again, what's the promised land look like once you solve it?
Yeah, I think about the selling the problem thing. If I think of what I hear from even CEOs at startups, right? And I get it. Look, it's tough, right? You spent the last 3 years building this amazing thing. You're really proud of it. It's got all the whiz bang stuff that you dreamed it would have, and it's going to be different and all the rest of it. And when I talk to people about getting away from just talking about the product, they can do it a little bit, but it's almost like the knee jerk, the reaction that this
Totally.
magnetism is drawing them back to say, and now I want to get onto the good stuff, which is me talking about my product. How do you help people
Everybody's
kind of
proud.
get past that?
Well, everybody's proud of their product, right? And that's the first thing they want to talk about. But one way to do it, what I do with a lot of our early stage customers is what's the founder story? Maybe you talk about that. Oh, I was working for this company and I was in the security ops department and XY I kept bumping up into this and it really, really sucked. It was hard and it was killing us and blah, 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 and slowing us down and causing friction. Stuff was still getting through. And because all the threats that we were seeing were new and et cetera, et cetera. So I decided to go do something about it. Right. And I called this the XYZ problem. And all my colleagues called the XYZ problem. And then we went out and started a company. Right. And we're looking for our first 5 customers that also think this is a big problem. Right. Forward looking customers that think this is also a problem. And they want to get ahead of it before their competition does. And that's who we want to talk to. Right. There's a charter member group of customers we want to create a movement with that really get it, the smart ones that understand, that want to get ahead of the curve here and provide a cybersecurity advantage to their companies by solving this problem. That's one way to do it. It's more natural because it's, why did you start the company? So a founder story is a really good natural way to talk about the problem and bring it up.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to do. I've seen people struggle with it quite a bit, but you're right. Some founder stories are really compelling. Some, not so. Right? It's a little very capitalistic.
Sometimes you got to
And
make it up.
right, right, right. You got to figure out what your version is of your founder story, I guess.
Well, the other way to do it too is, say you do have a handful of customers, right? We started the cybersecurity company. We thought we had a good idea. All of a sudden, we saw 5 customers, right? And let me tell you what these 5 customers, what they're telling us, right? Oh, well, they ran into the XYZ problem all the time. This is a pain in the ass. This is blah, 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 right? And everything we had in here in our cybersecurity stack wasn't helping, right? We needed something completely different. So that's the other way. Just put a logo up of your 5 top customers and say, let me walk you through each of these customers. What do they all have in common, right? Oh, the XYZ problem.
I love that. Love that. Um, Go back to our situation where we're that small company making inroads in the market, whether it's a dominant player or a new category. How do you know that you've nailed it? Right? How do you know it's really actually working?
Well, I think the way we always measure positioning, and again, I think positioning is a company initiative, not a marketing initiative, because if you do it right, it's going to help you, shape the category, set the buying criteria up. It's going to accelerate your revenue and give direction to your product team, as well as fuel your marketing investments. So there's really 2 metrics that I look at. One category of metrics is sales cycles. What percentage of sales cycles am I actually engaging at the executive level? What percentage of my sales cycles am I increasing my average selling price of a deal? Am I improving my win-loss ratio? Am I collapsing the length of my sales cycles because my narrative is creating urgency? Those are always great metrics that I look at that are very measurable from a sales perspective. From a category perspective, are the market analysts starting to pick up my language? Are they beginning to echo my viewpoint? Over time, am I moving into a magic quadrant? Am I creating a magic quadrant, right? Those are all really, really good metrics. And um, then I always look at today, you got to look at expansion, right? So and a lot of times it's helpful to set the expansion up right from the get-go and take customers on a journey. So I always look at expansion rates, right? Within my existing customer, what percentage of those customers, when it's appropriate, am I expanding, right? And driving my CLV through my clients. So this is some of the metrics that I look at to know if your position is working or not.
And when you said that it's a company initiative, not a marketing initiative, the first thing I thought was, what if the CEO doesn't want to get involved? Is that something that you would would you take on a client if the CEO wouldn't do that? Or
I wouldn't do it. No, I think it's interesting. If I look just the end of the last year, I'd say 75% of our engagements came from the board or CEO. That's who initiated it. Because I think in these crowded markets now, CEOs are thinking, first off, we're in a growth efficiency era. right? It's not a land grab, it's growth efficiency. So you can't be a nice to have product, you got to be a gotta have. And I think CEOs realizing that status quo is the competition and we have a tighter buying climate. And they're looking at positioning, they're recognizing positioning as a key lever for them that can not only set the North Star for the company, that can really help drive growth efficiency. So now marketing usually runs the process, right? And they're operationalize the positioning, but the CEO typically is the one that is the sponsor of the initiative. When we run our process through companies, certainly the CMO is there, the CEO is there, the CRO is there, the chief product officer. We want all parts of the company in that conversation because it's really, first off, everybody has to be aligned right around a single message and to focus the company and keep it aligned. But really, what's interesting if you do it that way, like for example, if I ask, what's the best thing about your product? What's the most differentiated thing? I may hear very different answers from customer support versus product versus sales or even the CEO. I want all those ideas on the table, right? Because I'll come up with better positioning. So it's really important that the CEO uses the positioning process as a way to drive alignment, but actually get everybody's voice and perspective in the room to build actually a better positioning.
How do you get consensus though if you got 5 different views on why we're so wonderful, right? I guess the danger is that it becomes very watered down, trying to keep everyone happy.
Well, that's why it's helpful to have somebody from the outside come in and facilitate that. Don't do this alone. It's really, really hard because if you're a CEO or CMO, you're always seen as having an agenda. So that's why they're looking. They want to they want to have a process, whether it's Firebricks, we want to have a process and have an outsider run the group through the process because it's a lot easier for an outsider. But really, it's all about how do you up level it to a larger conversation. That's the hard part. Um, that can be inclusive really of everybody. But I find that most companies are pretty aligned on what their differentiation is. Where they're not aligned a lot of times is their go-to-market strategy. Some companies just want to call on anything that moves, right? And other executives say we got to really, really focus. But the question is, where do you focus, right? And the more clear you can get about where your revenue is coming from, what those buyers look like, and keep the discipline and focus on it, the faster you're going to accelerate your traction in the marketplace, and the better you can build a position that resonates with those specific buyers, not with everybody else.
What I've tend to find, Bob, is that there is, generally speaking, some alignment around why we're different, except when it comes to the sales team, because they go out and talk to people, and they get the immediate reaction of still blank stares, like I don't get it, or no, you're not as different as you think you are. I talked to 3 companies last week, and they said exactly the same thing. And they kind of start playing around, right? They say, well, if it's not that, what is it? If I say it this way, does it matter? How do I do this better? Things like that. And that's where, become a little bit out of lockstep, I guess, with the rest of the company. Do you see that as well? And if so, like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I guess the question is, what do you want to make the fight about? What's the buying criteria going to be about? That's the question to ask. What do I want to make the fight about? If you have some unique IP that nobody else has, it's very, very easy to say we're going to make the fight about this XYZ feature or capability or architecture, right? But in the absence of that, it's hard because everybody else says you have the same thing. Or if you do a really good job positioning, your competition copies you, and the next day on their website shows up exactly like you. So the question is, what do you want to make the fight about? If the buying criteria, and sometimes it's not one thing, it might be 3 things. And if the buying criteria was based on these three capabilities or features, we would win every time. That's your positioning. And the question is, what are those 3 feet? What problem does those 3 features really, really solve really, really well? And build a case that this problem is the number one issue facing your executive at this moment. It's not going to get any better. And if you solve it, you'll be a hero. And here are the 3 key capabilities you really need to solve that. And then if the buying criteria is based upon those 3 capabilities, you win every single time, then that's the winning positioning to take.
So that's where the clarity has to come from, especially on the sales side. Because on a seller side, you need to engineer the discussion so that you're asking questions about, the things that you want the conversation to be about, right? And what I call the unfair advantage kind of questions. You drive the conversation in that direction, and shine the light on the problem area and see how they're thinking about dealing with it, if at all, things like that. And then from there, you can actually build a deal that you got a much better chance of winning than if you let the
That's
criteria
correct.
get a drift away from you.
The worst place to be is in RFP land where you responded to RFPs and somebody else has set the RFP for you. What a waste of time and energy and effort, right? So how do you own the market before it gets to an RFP and own the buying criteria before that? And like you said, can you shape the buying criteria into your favor? And that's part of the key tenets, one of the key tenets of positioning.
Bob, last question for you. So let's go back to our early stage team. They're out there fighting the fight. They're doing their thing. Give them some inspiration or assurance that it's worth keeping doing the fight and worth thinking about things at a higher level and starting with the battles you want to win, things like that. How is it going to pay off for them?
Well, I think it's a really, really exciting time to be in cybersecurity and B2B tech right now. My goodness, there is so much innovation going on right now. And the good news is we are in a different business inflection point. At every significant business inflection point, and I'm from the past, right? Every significant inflection point that's ever happened gave rise to a new set of category leaders. It's going to happen again right now because, again, what was the success of the past is now irrelevant. And more executive buyers are open to doing things differently because they're facing a completely different future than they ever had before. And so that provides an opening for any significant tech innovation to come out. And I think particularly, you just see it. There's waves and waves of new innovation that technologies that's happening right now today. And I think that's a really exciting time to be in here. And I think more and more executives are open to innovation, open to doing things a little differently. Because again, I think we're in a completely different business climate that we have. So take advantage of this opportunity. It's here right now, and be the next category leader that has to be disrupted a decade from now.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. If someone wants to get in touch and continue the conversation, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, just send me an email, Bob at firebk.com, or go to our website, firebk.com.
RBK.com. There you go. Well, Bob, listen, I've enjoyed our conversation. This is to my mind, this is such an important area. And it's often, I think, at earlier stage, maybe a little bit overlooked as they're, trying to build a product and get some sales. But sometimes, well, most times, having the cohesive view about how you're going to position yourself and how you're going to take that fight on, I think is so important. And we don't want to lose that
All
in
right.
those early stage conversations.
All right, Andrew. Well, thank you very much and keep bringing it.
For those that know me and work with me, you'll know that this is a topic that is very hot for me. And the reason is, often when I go in and I work with sales teams and go to market teams on what they're doing and trying to fix issues that they're experiencing, if you really get down to it, the root cause is on the things that Bob was talking about in this episode, right? If some of the fundamentals and the clarity around the positioning and how you're going to describe what you do and take your corner of the room aren't clear, it's very hard for the sales team and the marketing team to execute at a high level. So getting clarity on these things is actually kind of important. The good news is once you get that clarity, then everything else downstream often becomes easier. So takeaways from me from this conversation. First of all, I love this saying, positioning is not a marketing initiative, it is a company initiative to be led by the CEO. And when you're trying to do something so inherent to the success of the company, it needs to have that CEO level of leadership. If you ever get involved in a situation where it's just given to the marketing team to go figure out, it's not going to get the buy-in throughout the whole organization. Other people are not going to feel like they've been heard, and it's going to die a slow death. So positioning is not a marketing initiative, it is a company initiative. Marketing leads it internally, but it has to be a company initiative. Second thing was the idea that he says about making the CISO or the buyer the hero in the transaction that's happening, and orient everything you do around making sure that they realize they'll be the hero and that you're making them be the hero. It is funny how often in a technology world, we think that the most important things are the factual things, the logical things, the our thing is faster, our thing is better, we do more of this, our reporting's better, get more depth to it, things like that. These are all things that could be important. But at the end of the day, when you're thinking about whoever is going to stick their neck out and want to buy your stuff, helping them be successful and be a hero internally can be really, really impactful. So asking yourselves, if this company, this person, this persona is going to buy from us, how can we help them be the hero around this? And the third takeaway I had was what he said about listening to early customers. Now, that seems like an obvious thing to say. I get it, right? We always want to be listening. But, he put it in the context of thinking about what you can learn from them to help positioning, right? He talked about asking questions such as what triggered them to look at this space or look at trying to solve this problem initially. What happened to cause them to put cycles into this to want to solve it? Asking them, why do they actually buy from you specifically? And importantly, I guess the real takeaway is what words do they use to describe what they thought that you would do for them, what you actually do for them, what they actually think you do, things like that, right? In there is the gold mine for positioning. They're going to use similar words across different customers. You're going to start pulling together some of these threads and realizing that, how you describe the problem is not how people in the real world describe the problem. That happens a lot. But there's learning there to be had, right? Learning to be had from your early customers and seeing what they say, how they describe things. So those were my takeaways, and I'm sure you got your own ones. But to me, that was a great conversation with Bob. I think it's super meaningful. I really do. I think that if you're at that stage and you're scrambling away, trying to find your little corner of the room, as Bob was talking about, I think having an approach and a framework to work off can be so helpful for you. So with that, I hope you take some of the recommendations that Bob had to heart. And I wish Bob and Firebrick every success as usual. They're a well-known name in Silicon Valley, and they're trusted by many companies, many executives to do the right thing by them. So I wish everyone great success.